really interesting one on Gaia and Chthonia, right? Chthonic. These are both, he says, names in ancient Greek for the earth, right? But he said they had distinct, they're Gaia and Chthon, Gaia and Chthonia or Chthonic. But he says they're distinct, if not opposite. Contrary to popular understanding, today men just don't live in Gaia, but in Chthon as well. And so he goes into some background about this. He talks about a lot of mythological stories, theogonies, etc. He says, for example, in one of them, that Gaia is a kind of supplementary name to the more primordial one of Chthon. And that, for example, in Homer, men are called epikthonioi, which is standing on Chthon, right? Whereas in Homer, epigaios refers only to plants and animals. So he's like, these are two aspects of the earth. They're distinct. They're not synonymous, as we might try to think about them, or erase one in lieu of the other, as we have tended to do, he says, erasing chthonic, in favor of Gaia, the happy one. And he says there are two aspects of the earth, geologically antithetical. Chthon is the outer face of the underworld, the earth from its surface downwards, whereas Gaia is the earth from its surface upwards. Chthon can't be cultivated, can't be owned, whereas Gaia nourishes all that is on Chthon. It produces crops, enriches us. Then he tells us another story in which Chthonia, as the goddess that Chthon is manifest as, incarnated as, can't be naked and so has to be covered with Gaia. Then he goes on to say Chthonia is depth, recess, the hidden, the mysterious, caverns, doors, souls passing in between birth and death through the chthonic doors, Chthonia is shapeless and hidden, and that Gaia covers over all this with the variegated embroidery of flowery countrysides and woods and things like that. And then he talks about the Persephone story, the one where Hades comes up from out of the underworld and steals Persephone and takes her back into the underworld. The underworld component that's discussed here is Chthon, when he's rising out of Chthon. It's an upsurgence of the underworld, of the mysterious, of the realm of I don't know, things hidden, since the foundations of the world. And then going back in is an escape from Gaia, right? So both of these words get deployed there in this story, he's saying. He says the Latin word for Chthon is not tellus, like telluric or something, with its horizontal axis. That being earth, another word for earth, but is humus, with its with this sort of downward trajectory included in that word. And he says it's significant that man is named for that, for humus, human, right? And that it shows that it's linked to the fact that our terrestrial existence is connected to Chthon and not to Gaia. The original meaning of the world also, mundus, as we said before, was a portal in Rome that connected the living world to the chthonic world of the dead. So we're linked to the chthonic in terms of the way that we think about the world, in terms of the way that we think about ourselves, the nature of human beings, the world that we live in, the very horizon of our existence. We're beings, he says, of the depths. And then he goes on to talk about the Etruscan civilization as archetypally chthonic. I don't know a lot about them, but apparently they built their cities in kind of this vertiginous way along the vertical axis with like cavernous sites and things like that. And he said he talks about how this style reminds us that our home on the earth is vertical and that we're connected to this vertical dimension. And he talks about sarcophaguses, and that this verticality shows us the movement, from living to dead too, right? That we're building the buildings at the bottom were constructed by our ancestors. We're living on top of the world that we built, that they built, literally. And so they're here with us. It shows more clearly the link between the living and the dead. which is, he thinks, very important. We need to have some kind of connection to the dead. Again, he's getting into all this stuff that, to me, is very right-wing, or connects, in some sense, his ruminations to ideas of the right, that there's a contract with the dead. The dead should not be forgotten. We should carry on their legacy, try to honor them, do things for the generations that come after us, and not have this focus on just the present, right? And he says, hopefully we'll never build a civilization in which the sphere of the dead is excluded. We don't want to do that. The life is more lovable when we remember this chthonic dimension and these depths. And then he gets into talking about climate change and stuff like that. How the biosphere has tended to be thought of as the surface of the earth to the atmosphere, right? Excluding the chthonic dimension and the effects of that, and fossil fuels, and how it's literally the dead under the ground that are powering all this stuff, etc. It's sort of interesting, but yeah, he thinks that if we forget Chthon, we forget everything that makes life worth living, and court destruction. Then he has one called Communist Capitalism, in which he says, the capitalism consolidating on a planetary scale today is not the form that it took in the West, but rather a communist variant of it, which combined an extremely rapid development of production with totalitarian political control. And that this is the historical significance of the leading role that China is assuming, economically, but also politically, and in terms of designing a paradigm for human governance, as we're seeing with the pandemic, and the role they've taken over with the pandemic. Even like the form of quarantine, right? It was novel, and we all implemented it basically following China's lead. And he says the regimes established in self-styled communist countries were a particular form of capitalism, and that was all known. But to anyone who can read history, but entirely unexpected was that this form of capitalism, which seemed to have exhausted its task and therefore become obsolete, was instead destined to become, in a technologically updated configuration, the dominant principle in the current phase of globalized capitalism. It is possible, in fact, that today we're witnessing a conflict between Western capitalism, which coexisted with the rule of law, bourgeois democracies, with this kind of new communist capitalism, from which the latter appears to be emerging as victorious. And he says, what is certain, however, is that the new regime will unite within itself the most inhuman aspects of capitalism with the most atrocious elements of statist communism, combining the extreme alienation of relations between men with unprecedented social controls. And that this is the dominant principle in the current phase of global capitalism. It's a little pessimistic, but I think I agree. Okay, we're almost done here, guys. We're almost done. He says, there's another one saying, what's happening on a planetary scale today is certainly the end of a world. Not in the transition to a world more suited to the needs of human beings, other than those who govern it for their interest, but a new world nonetheless. The age of bourgeois democracies is passing, with its rights and its constitutions and its parliaments. This is the end of a world that began with the Industrial Revolution and grew into the totalitarianisms that accompanied them. If the powers that govern the world felt that they had the need to resort to such extreme measures and devices as biosecurity and sanitary terror, which they instigated everywhere and without reservation, but which are now threatening to get out of hand, that's because they feared, according to every available evidence, of having no other choice to survive. So this is an extreme measure in order to be able to preserve the future for themselves and their children of the actual ruling class, right? And if people accepted these despotic measures and unprecedented constraints to which they have been subjected without any guarantee, he says it's not just because they're afraid of the pandemic, because they're afraid of the virus. That's not sufficient to explain the way that they have allowed their lives to be sort of totally destroyed and reorganized in this way. But presumably because more or less unconsciously they already knew that the world in which they lived could not continue. That we all already thought that the end of the world was coming, that the system couldn't continue to function as it had been, right? And so this sort of resignation to the annihilation of the world that we inhabited together is also a big part of our acceptance of all these measures. That we thought at some level that it was too unfair, too inhumane, too too brutal, too lonely. I don't know. And so he says it goes without saying that governments are preparing an even more inhumane, even more unjust world. But in any case, on both sides, it was somehow presumed that the former world, as it is now beginning to be called, could not continue. There is certainly in this, as in every dark presentiment, a religious element. Health has taken the place of salvation. Biological life has taken the place of eternal life. And the church, which has become accustomed to compromise itself with worldly needs, he says, has more or less consented to its replacement. This is something we talked about again in the other video a lot. We do not regret that this world ends, he says. I mean, I do. I regret it. We have no nostalgia for the idea of the human and the divine, for the previous idea of the human and the divine. Speak for yourself, dude. But that the relentless waves of time are erasing like a face of sand on the shore of history. But with equal determination, we reject. So we're not nostalgic for this that's being erased like this, as though it never existed, being forgotten. We're not nostalgic for previous forms of life, he says. I disagree with him. But he says, nevertheless, with equal determination, we have to reject this new world that's coming into being. The naked, mute, and faceless life, the religion of health that government is offering us. We're not expecting a new God or a new man. Rather, we have to seek here and now among the ruins that surround us for a humbler, simpler form of life, which is not a mirage, because we have a memory and experience of it, even if in us and outside us, adverse powers reject it each time into oblivion. Then he has one, a country without a face. He says all living beings occur in the open and communicate with each other, but only man has a face. This goes back to the kind of phenomenology of the face that we were talking about in the other one. Only man has a face. He makes his appearance and his communications with others a fundamental experience, and he does it with the face, and the face becomes a site of truth. What it exposes and reveals is beyond words, right? Expressions and things like that. They can be linguistically incommunicable, but you can see the suffering, the anxiety, the optimism, the admiration. The face communicates something beyond words does. In his face, more than the word, he expresses himself and reveals himself. The face is thus also a place of politics, because it's a place of self-revelation and recognition, mutual recognition. And he says, if men had to communicate always and only information, then there couldn't be politics, but just an exchange of messages. But since they first of all have their openness to communicate pure sort of communicability, the face is the very condition of political life. The true city of men, the political element par excellence. It's by looking into the face of the other that we recognize and become passionate about one another, that we care about one another, that we have mutual interests, that we perceive similarity and dissimilarity, distance and proximity. And so he says a country that decides to give up its face, to cover the faces of its citizens with masks everywhere, is thus a country that has erased all political dimensions from itself. It's an empty space, subjected at every moment to limitless control, in which now move individuals isolated from each other who have lost their immediate and sensitive foundations of their community and who can only exchange messages directed to names without faces. Then he has another one called Two Names, in which he names these two, I guess, professors in Italy, Alessandro La Fortesa and Andrea Camperio Ciani. And he says that these are two names we should remember and that we should follow their example, because they're resigning out of a refusal to accept a government which produces second-class citizens, right, from people who refuse the Green Pass. And so he thinks they're admirable, we should follow their lead. And at the same, and insofar as we do follow their lead and take their example and manifest that example in ourselves and everything, then, we'll be doing well. And he says that it's time for us, after 2 years of state of exception and after the cancellation of most of our elementary freedoms, to discover the political consciousness which otherwise seems to have totally disappeared from our schools and universities. And then the last one here, well, sort of, I'm gonna read some from a speech afterward, but he's got another article here called Lemmings, in which he talks about the namesake famous type of thing. I didn't know it was a real thing, but he says that they're, an animal that undertakes for no apparent reason, periodically, collective migrations that end with mass suicide, throwing themselves into the sea, right? And he says that we take it for granted that all living beings want to live. And the example of the lemmings shows us that that's not true, that there's a failure in their will to life, right? And their life instinct is transformed into a death instinct. And he thinks that something is happening, as you might have guessed, with us right now, and that our collective suicide occurs in a very complex way because we're very complex kinds of organisms, right? We've replaced instinct with language, our what he calls endosomatic sensitivity, we've replaced with external devices, with prostheses. And so he says that for us, we can't live if we don't give ourselves reasons to live. Religious reasons, mythical reasons, ideological reasons. And today all these reasons are falling away, particularly, as he says, in the richest and most technologized parts of the earth, because collectively we're all being reduced to bare life, to pure biological survival. And he says that nothing else other than this kind of transformation from a life instinct to a death instinct could explain why, instead of the simple, lovable fact of living together side by side, we have felt the need to install an implacable sanitary terror in which life at every instance and without any more ideal justification is threatened and punished by disease and death. That alone can explain, he says, why the vaccine producers can state that it's impossible to predict the long-term consequences of the vaccine, and why we can have still pending sort of studies on genotoxicity and carcinogenicity of these studies, right, of these vaccines. They're still outstanding. There's still information we don't have about them, and yet already millions have been subjected to mass vaccination campaigns. He says that's the only way to explain that particular phenomenon. And then just to end here, I wanted to read a little bit from pieces as I talk about it, from a speech he gave at the Conference of Venetian Students Against the Green Pass on November 11th, 2021 at Castegredo. I don't know what that is. But so he's giving this speech in front of these students who are refusing the Green Pass, right? And he says that we have to realize, first of all, this radical transformation that's taking place, the legal and political order that we all thought we lived in has changed dramatically, rapidly, forever, right? And he starts talking about how he had been kind of thinking in this direction, that this was the drift of our political situation previously, and the operator of this transformation is something he talked about with his theory of the state of exception, that it's this zone of indifference between law and politics which constitutes the state of emergency. And that 20 years ago he wrote this book that I've been referring to, in which he attempted to provide a theory of the state of exception, and he found that it was becoming the normal state of government. And he reminds us a space of the suspension of law, therefore an anomic space, anomos, without norms, right? Without law, in which seemingly capriciously power can be exercised on you and remove you from the civic order or not, and somehow this is supposed to be included within the legal system. And he says, let's take a closer look at what happens in the state of exception. From the technical point of view, there's a separation of the force of law from law in a formal sense, right? From legal power being exercised on you in some sense versus laws as they are codified, right? And the state of exception defines a state of the law in which, on the one hand, the law is theoretically in force. We're supposed to still somewhat have parliamentary democracy, our laws, our constitution, our rights, etc. But somehow these laws don't have any force, right? So there's laws against privacy or whatever, yet everyone can ask you about your vaccine status, and it can be a determinant for whether you can participate in society, right? An obvious invasion of privacy. Somehow the right to privacy no longer exists, right? It doesn't have any force. It doesn't apply, even though the law itself continues to exist. It's in suspension. And other provisions and measures, decrees that aren't part of the law, right, suddenly acquire the force of law and act upon you as forcefully as if it were law. And he says it could be said that in the limit, what is at stake in the state of exception is a force of law that fluctuates without the law. Right? The law is suspended, but the force of law continues to be applied. However, this situation is defined, whether the state of exception is considered as internal or if it is qualified instead as external to the legal order. In any case, it translates into a sort of eclipse of the law in which, as in an astronomical eclipse, it persists but no longer emanates its light. And he says the first consequence of this is that the failure of the fundamental principle of legal certainty. If the state, instead of giving regulatory discipline to a phenomenon, intervenes thanks to emergency, then it no longer responds, the phenomenon no longer responds to a principle of legality, since the principle of legality consists in the fact that the state gives the law and citizens have to trust that law and its stability, right? The situation has been gone beyond. The state of exception is becoming universalized, he says. The paradigm of the law is replaced by that of vague clauses and formulas such as state of necessity, security, public order, which are indeterminate in themselves and require someone intervening in order to determine them. Someone's got to exercise this force of law, which is beyond the formal law, right? That's the Schmittian idea of the sovereign and stuff, right? Someone has to make this decision, and they're being made in the name of these vague formulas of security, biosecurity, etc. We're no longer dealing with law or constitutions, but with a fluctuating force of law that can be assumed, as we see today, by commissions and individuals, doctors or experts who are entirely outside of the legal system, outside of the political system, who are not thereby accountable to the public. And so then he starts talking about the dual state, and this is the part that I thought was pretty interesting, or the double state, and he's referring to Ernst Fraenkel, describing the Nazi government. And he says the dual state is one in which there's a normative state and it's accompanied by a discretionary state, right? The discretionary state being basically public administration. This is the legacy of Woodrow Wilson in our country. It's what's called the deep state by certain people. It's in this lineage, he says, of the double state, the dual state, in which we must locate a phenomenon whose importance cannot be underestimated, and which concerns the change in the very figure of the state that is taking place before our eyes. I mean what American political scientists call the administrative state. And then this is interesting to me because I follow Adrian Vermeule, and he's saying that it found its most recent theorization in a book by Vermeule and Sunstein called Law and Leviathan Redeeming the Administrative State. So again, there's this convergence of right and left. That's kind of a theme of myself and of the channel, where there's a realignment ongoing. The lines are being redrawn, sides are being redeclared, etc. A lot of what he's saying is the same kind of stuff that you see Trumpers or whatever say in terms of talking about the need to dismantle the administrative state, or the deep state, and how dangerous the deep state and the administrative state are. And he says it's a model of state where governance, the exercise of government, goes beyond the traditional division of powers, the legislative, executive, or judicial branches, and stuff that's provided for in the Constitution, right, in the name of administration, and in a discretionary way, the functions and powers that belong to the three constitutionally competent subjects. So it's this different government within a government, say, the administrative state, which functions beyond these three branches, functions beyond any powers enumerated in the Constitution, etc. And it's sort of a purely administrative Leviathan, which is supposed to act in the interests of the community and even infringes upon the dictates of the law and the Constitution in order to ensure and guide not the free choice of citizens, but what Sunstein calls navigability. That is, in reality, the governability of the choices of individuals. This is what is happening all too evidently today when we see the decision-making power being exercised by commissions, doctors, etc. Through these factual procedures, the Constitution is altered in a much more substantial way than through the power of revision, right? The effect of law, the force of law, what's actually done, right? What the administration actually does, it goes way beyond the kinds of powers that are supposed to be granted to the government, right? And that could be granted to the government through revision, through amendment. They're accruing powers that even the amendment process wouldn't really be able to give them. And we've talked about this in other videos and stuff, right? Provided by until it becomes, as a disciple of Marx said, just a piece of paper, right? It makes of society a piece of paper. It makes of man a piece of paper upon which they can write whatever they want, do whatever they want, right? It turns the Constitution into a kind of blank piece of paper. And it's certainly significant that these transformations are modeled on the dual structure of Nazi governance, and that it is perhaps the very concept of government, of a policy such as cybernetics or the art of government, that needs to be questioned. And he says that it's said that the modern state thrives on assumptions that it can't guarantee. It's possible that the situation I've tried to describe to you is the form in which the absence of guarantees has reached its critical mass, and that the modern state giving up, as is evident today, to guarantee its presuppositions has reached the end of its history. And it is this end that we are perhaps experiencing. He says, I believe that any discussion on what can or should be done today must start from the realization that the civilization in which we are currently living has collapsed. Or rather, given that it is a society based on finance, has gone bankrupt. That our culture was on the verge of a general bankruptcy had been evident for decades, and the clearest minds of the 20th century had diagnosed it without any reservations. I cannot fail to recall with what force and with how much dismay Pasolini and Elsa Morante in the 60s, that now seem so much better than the present. I don't know. Denounced the inhumanity and barbarism they saw growing all around them. It is up to us today. Of being no longer on the threshold, but within this intellectual, ethical, religious. I'm having trouble with that section. Sorry. So what do we do in such a situation, he asks. And he says, on an individual level, of course, we have to continue as far as possible to do well what we have tried to do well, even if there seems to be no reason to do it anymore. Indeed, for this very reason, to continue. But I don't think that's enough. Hannah Arendt, in a reflection that we cannot help but feel close because it was entitled On Humanity in Dark Times, asked herself, to what extent we remain obliged to the world and to the public sphere, even when we have been expelled from it, as happened with her. She was herself I think she was in a gulag and a Nazi internment camp, if I remember correctly. Or as we've had to withdraw from them as people who fled, obviously. I think it's important today not to forget that if we find ourselves in a similar condition, it is because we have been forced, and that therefore it is a choice that remains political in any case, even if it seems to be placed outside the world. Arendt pointed to friendship as the possible foundation for a policy in dark times, here again with this kind of Benedict option thing. I think that indication is correct as long as we remember that friendship, that is, the fact of feeling an otherness in our own experience of existing, is a sort of minimum. That is, as long as we remember that we are dealing with nothing less than trying to establish a society or a community within society everywhere. That is, in the face of the growing depoliticization of individuals, to rediscover in friendship the radical principle of a renewed politicization. It seems to me that you, students, have started to do this by creating your own association, but you have to extend it more, because the very possibility of living in a way that befits human beings depends on it. In conclusion, I would like to address the students who are present here and who have invited me to speak. I would like to remind you of something. Should be there. Before living in a country and in a state, men have their vital home in language. And I believe that only if we are able to investigate and understand this vital home and how it's been manipulated and transformed, will we be able to understand how the transformations could have taken place in the first place. These political and legal issues have forced themselves before our eyes, right? We have to force them before our eyes. The hypothesis that I intend to suggest to you is that the transformation of the relationship with language is the condition of all other transformations of society. Again, this is something the right talks about a lot now. And it goes, it's coming from people like Gramsci, the idea of cultural hegemony, etc. Cultural hegemony is tied up with language, the language we speak, the language we speak and its manipulations by people in positions of power, etc. And if we don't realize it, it's because language by definition remains hidden in what it names and gives us to understand. Language is beyond merely the names that we have for things. It consists of a kind of structure of naming, right? It's about ultimately self-definition and describing the world, constituting the world, not merely naming the things in it. As a psychoanalyst who is also a bit of a philosopher once said, what is remains forgotten in what is meant by what is said. What is said remains forgotten in what is meant by what is said. I don't know, the phraseology there is a little tough. We are used to looking at modernity as that historical process that begins with the Industrial Revolution in England and with the political revolution in France, but we do not ask ourselves what revolution in the relationship of men with language has made possible what Polanyi called the Great Transformation. Karl Polanyi, the economist. It is certainly significant that the revolutions from which modernity was born were accompanied, if not preceded by, a problematization of reason, that is, of what defines man as a speaking animal. Ratio comes from reor, which means to count, calculate, right? Reason, rationality as calculative, etc., which is important because we're talking about man as the rational animal, the calculating animal, etc. He's pointing to this transformation and the idea of what a human being is and what reason is. This is a Heideggerian point, moving into this kind of objectifying, calculating mode of reason, right? That has been transformed in that direction in modernity into Gestell, as Heidegger calls it. The dream of reason, having become a goddess, coincides with the rationalization of language and of the experience of language that allows us to fully account for and govern nature and at the same time the life of human beings. And what is what we now call science, if not a practice of language, a discourse, that tends to eliminate any ethical, poetical, and philosophical experience of the world in the speaker in order to transform language into a neutral tool for the exchange of information. If science can never answer our need for happiness, it is because it ultimately presupposes not a speaking being, but a biological body as mute. So he's saying that our language, that rationalization and scientificization, right, that these are tied in with this political transformation that we're observing and the transformation of man into bare life. Biology is calculable, quantifiable, etc. But human being in his poetical constitution is not. If science can never answer our need for happiness, it's because... and how must the speaker's relationship with his language be transformed so that, as is happening today, the very possibility of distinguishing truth from falsehood fails? If today doctors, jurists, and scientists accept a discourse that renounces asking questions about the truth, but only calculates, right? They only calculate. In that masterpiece of 20th century ethics that is Hannah Arendt's book on Eichmann, Arendt observes that Eichmann was a perfectly reasonable man, but that he was unable to think, that is, to interrupt the flow of discourse that dominated his mind, that he was not able to question, only to execute orders, only to calculate the variables necessary to the execution of certain orders, right? The first task that faces us then is the rediscovering a springing and almost dialectical relationship that is poetic and thinking with our language. Only in this way we'll be able to get out of the impasse that humanity seems to have taken, and that will most likely lead to extinction, if not physical, at least ethical and political. Rediscovering thought as a dialect, impossible to formalize and format. So he's tying all this stuff in with the general process and the crisis of reason in Western man, with the way language functions, the way language discloses man in this era as an object for calculation, as biological, right? He's saying that in order to get ourselves out of this crisis, we also have to think about the language that we use, what language is for, what it means to be human being, what is worth preserving in the human being. Right. So that was the last thing of his that I wanted to cover here. I hope you guys really enjoyed this. It was very long, so I'm going to split it into two. Oh, the sudden, change of clothes or whatever. That was my son woke up from his nap, so I had to go take care of him. My wife was at work, so I had to take care of him. And now today is the next day. I'm doing this after my work when he's napping again. So. That's why the sudden change here. I hope it wasn't too bothersome. But I thought this was really interesting stuff. I didn't really intend to talk about more pandemic stuff, but someone asked the question about Agamben and whether he had continued to say anything of interest, and I looked into it and I thought that this stuff was of interest and it was worth covering. Very worth covering. And hopefully that was good. It was good to catch up with Agamben. Remember, don't just react, but think culture. Until next time.